So hey guys, welcome to another Warframe video, and today I want to talk about damage types and elemental damage in Warframe. So there are three basic damage types that are on almost every weapon in Warframe: Impact, Puncture, and Slash. And without any modifications like the Corrosive Projection aura, Impact is really good against the Corpus, Puncture is really good against the Grineer and the Corrupted, and Slash is really good against the Infested. Now, the reason why certain damage types are better against certain factions is, well, those factions have either different flesh, or armor, or shields. For instance, 95% of the Grineer units have cloned flesh, but they can either have ferrite or alloy armor. And even though Slash would be better against the flesh, because it does 25% more damage, it does less damage against ferrite and alloy armor. And that's why Puncture is the best, because it has no additional effects on the cloned flesh or machinery, but it does 50% more damage against ferrite armor and 15% more damage against alloy armor. And the most important one here is the alloy armor, because this is worn by elite lancers, eviscerators, bombards, napalms, and the Grineer bosses. And since those are the toughest dudes, they have the most health, they have the most armor, and they do the most damage, you want to deal as much damage to them as possible, so you kill them as fast as possible. Now, those are just the three basic damage types, okay? But if we look into elemental damage and elemental combos, there are 10 additional damage types we can apply to our weapons to kick more ass. Now, in my opinion, it would be insane and useless, frankly, to go through all 10 damage types with all 4 factions one by one. So instead, I'm going to show you the best elemental and elemental combo damage to go up against each faction. So since I already talked about the Grineer, you know that the most dangerous units are the ones wearing alloy armor. Those are, once again, your bombards and napalms. So we're going to add radiation damage to our weapons, because radiation has no additional effects on the cloned flesh, ferrite, and machinery, and it does 75% more damage against the alloy armor. And radiation is created by combining heat and electricity. But sometimes you will have more than 2 slots for elemental damage, so you want to add more. So if you have 3 slots rather than 2, you can add cold damage as well. This once again has no additional effect on the cloned flesh, ferrite, and machinery, and does 25% more damage against the alloy armor. And if you somehow have 4 slots for elemental damage, you once again want to go with radiation, but instead of adding cold, you want to add viral damage. And this is a combination of cold and toxin damage. And even though viral damage has no additional effects on ferrite and alloy, and it does do 25% less damage against machinery, it does 75% more damage to cloned flesh, which makes up 95% of the Grineer faction. Now, if this isn't confusing enough, each damage type or elemental combo or elemental damage has their own proc as well, and this is determined by your status chance. So the higher the status chance, the higher chance of getting one of these procs. And with this particular setup, so Puncture, Radiation, and Viral, you can inflict one of the following debuffs. So with Puncture, you will reduce your target's damage output by 30% for 6 seconds. Radiation will reduce the accuracy of the enemy for 12 seconds, as well as confusing him, making his allies a valid target rather than just the only valid target being you. What I'm trying to say is he will shoot his friends in the face. And finally, we have viral damage, and this will reduce your target's hit points by 50% for 6 seconds. And here you can see pretty much the perfect setup to go up against the Grineer with. Now, I'm not saying this is a good build, this is just an example, okay? So we have the Boltor Prime, which by default has very high puncture damage, which, as we already know, is really good against the Grineer, and we have the radiation and viral elemental combos. Now let's talk about the Corpus. Now, the Corpus don't use armor at all, they use shields instead. And as a result, the best basic damage type to take against the Corpus is Impact. Because even though Impact does 25% less damage against flesh, which is all the human Corpus, it does 50% more damage against regular shields, 15% more damage against proto shields, and it has no additional effect on the robotic enemies like the Moas or the Ospreys. Now, if you can only fit in 2 elemental damage types onto your weapon, it should definitely be cold and electricity, which creates magnetic damage. This has no additional effect on the Corpus flesh or the robotic units, but it does 75% more damage against shields and proto shields. And if you can fit in 3 or more elemental damage types on your weapon, you should go straight up toxin damage. Now, this does 25% less damage to the robotic enemies, but it does 50% more damage to the Corpus flesh, and it completely bypasses all shields. Now, once again, if this wasn't confusing enough, you can also inflict the following status procs. So with Impact, you can inflict a knockback with a brief stagger. With Toxin, you can inflict a poison which will tick 9 times over 8 seconds and will deal 50% of your base weapon damage. And Magnetic damage will drain 75% of their shields over 4 seconds. And to add even more confusion, if you have a weapon that has really high impact damage compared to puncture or slash, you can forget about magnetic damage and go for viral damage instead, which is a combination of cold and toxin. But let's not faff about, you want to have an impact-based weapon with magnetic and toxin damage like my Prisma Gorgon you can see on the screen right now. And let's talk about the Infested. So the best basic damage type to use against the Infested is Slash damage, which does 25% more damage against the regular Infested, 50% more damage against the fleshy Infested, and 15% more damage against the fossilized Infested. Now, the elemental damage types you want to use is Corrosive and Heat, with Corrosive not doing any additional damage to the regular and the fleshy Infested, but doing 75% more damage to the fossilized units, which are your Ancients, Broodmothers, Boilers, and Moas. And if you can fit in one more elemental damage type, it should definitely be the Heat damage, which does 25% more damage against the regular Infested, and 50% more damage against the fleshy Infested, and having no additional effects on the fossilized units. Now, once again, with these damage types, you can inflict certain status procs. So with Slash, you can inflict a damage over time effect that will inflict 35% of your base weapon damage in 7 ticks over 6 seconds. The same goes for Heat damage, which will inflict 50% of the base damage in 7 ticks over 6 seconds, but it will also cause the enemies to flee in panic. And finally, we have Corrosive damage, which will strip away 25% of your target's armor. Now, this can be applied multiple times to get rid of even more armor. And once again, here is an example of a weapon that's primarily slash-based, like the Tigris, and it has the Corrosive and Heat damage added onto it. And moving on to the final faction, the Corrupted. Now, the Corrupted are slightly different, because rather than having 3 or 4 enemy types, they have much more, okay? So we have the Cloned Flesh, Regular Flesh, Ferrite Armor, Alloy Armor, Shields, Proto-Shields, Robotic Units, and Fossilized Units. Now, this is where it gets tricky, because if you're not running 4 corrosive projections in the Void, you're best off by using Puncture, Corrosive, and Cold. But if you are using 4 corrosive projections in the Void, you're best off using Slash, Viral, and Heat. So it's up to you. You have to look at the group, and you have to pick the correct damage types. Okay? Now, the reason behind this is when you're running 4 corrosive projections in the Void, you are stripping away the armor you would otherwise have to shoot through with puncture and corrosive damage. And since there's pretty much no armor anymore, you can take Slash, Viral, and Heat, which deal more damage to unarmored units, but don't deal very well with armored units. So here is an example of the no corrosive projection weapon. You know, we have puncture damage with corrosive and cold. And here is another example with corrosive projection where we're running Slash, Viral, and Heat. Now, yes, there are more elemental combos that you can use and put on your weapons, but they're not particularly good with any of the factions. They will shine in the right situation, but overall, they're just not that great, okay? So I thank you very much for watching once again. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye. By the way, if they decide to implement Damage 3.0 in Update 18 and make this video completely useless, I'm gonna be a very sad panda.